Hello dear chess friends of International Chess School. Today we will discuss some aspects of the attack, and we will focus how to discover critical moments and how to create a king attack when some of the key elements are creating favorable circumstances for the attack. I've been always amazed by grandmasters' ability to seize critical moments, especially when the enemy king is weakened or left alone just with the pawns, as in the position above, and how quickly the outcome of the game arises, how grandmasters are gaining advantage by creating a local PC superiority. Sometimes I was able to recognize the patterns behind the attack, but I soon realized that strong attacking players are able to create new patterns based on those favorable circumstances. There are four key elements for a successful attack, and we will stressing these aspects of attack, these elements. First is speed. The speed of an attack determines how quickly the attacker manages to develop the attack and how much time it takes for the defender to neutralize it. And sometimes we must calculate precisely and reckon the number of moves needed for each side. The second important element behind speed is the ability to create a local PC superiority, which means having a large number of attackers than the enemy defenders. According to other chess authors, this element of the king attack is known as creating a favorable ratio of attackers. You may know that usually you need 3 attackers. You can sacrifice one of the attackers, and with the remained 2 attackers, 2 attacking piece to deliver mate. The local PC superiority on the king not only create mate threats, but as a result of taking the king out of his nest, double attacks may appear and material gains are possible. It is important to search for the mate, but at the same time you have to remember that mate isn't the only way to win, especially when you manage to create a local PC superiority. The attacking pieces usually needs a coordinating piece with a long range of action, like queen or rook, and the attackers must be collaborating one with another. It means that the attacking pieces must target the same objectives, the same goals. The third element and the fourth element are connected. The third element is the pawn structure, and the fourth element are the weak squares. They're related to each other and are also important elements of the attack. As you may know already, in order to create an attack on the king side, a static or a closed center usually required. Otherwise the opponent may react in the center as long as we will slowly prepare the local PC superiority. What I noticed and wanted to share with you is that in the modern Grandmaster schemes, the attacking side uses an advanced pawn like we have now on the board, the e5 pawn, or in other cases long pawn chain. Why these pawns, these advanced pawns or pawn chains are needed? Not only for a better control over the central squares, but the key element in advancing a pawn or creating a pawn chain is that such a pawn structure hinders opponent's defensive maneuver, and we will focus later on this subject. Sometimes there are weak squares connected to the pawn structure in the enemy camp. Other times, like in this case, when the pawn structure in front of the black king is intact, we have to create weaknesses to lure the opponent to push the pawns and to create weak squares. But usually we will focus to attack on the squares available for our same color bishop. In our case, we will focus on attacking on dark squares. There are two important elements here: the e5 pawn, which controls two important dark squares, and the vulnerable g7 pawn on a dark square, the same color as our bishop from e3. If we don't have an attacking bishop, then we will focus on the color of available for our coordinating piece. If we are talking about the queen, the more vulnerable squares or pawn weaknesses from the queen point of view or the rook point of view, if the rook is the coordinating piece of our attack. Let's watch closely this game. The following position was extracted from a game played in September 2011 at in Austria at the Graz Chess Festival between the Grandmaster Shengelia David and the International Master Sakelsek Tadej. I suppose that White didn't know yet how he's gonna to win the game, but he realized the favorable circumstances for a king attack which are present on this position. First, speed. He can quickly activate the pieces with the help of tempo moves, and these threats are directed against the g7 pawn. Second, he can create a local pieces superiority, because in this case White is favored by the material equivalence, since in the middle game two minor pieces, the knight and the bishop, are stronger than rook and the pawn. But if they are coordinated, so an important task on White's to-do list will be to coordinate the knight and the bishop. So it is possible to create a local piece superiority on the king's side by bringing the queen, the bishop and the knight on the king's side. The third element is the pawn structure. The central pawn e5 does an excellent job. He can support an attacking piece on f6, but at the same time it keeps black's major pieces away from the king's side, so it would be difficult for black to actively participate in defense. In terms of weak squares, which is the fourth element of attack, a weak spot around the black king could be g7. Since white has the dark square bishop, and we already have to imagine here the way through g7. So the bishop has to be placed on f6 or h6. Of course, if white manages to create a local PC superiority on the king's side, he will try to provoke pawn moves in front of the black king. But when he decides to play for a win, he already has to have a weakness like g7, a weak spot where he can coordinate the queen and the bishop in attack before it starts the attack. He has to analyze these four elements: speed, the possibility to create a local PC superiority, the pawn structure, which are the implications of the pawn structure, and in the fourth place, the weak squares. Everything went very quickly. We are at the move 23 now. Queen g3, a tempo move. It threatens bishop h6. If black allows bishop h6, then it will be forced to push g7, g6, and the dark squares will be extremely vulnerable. All white has to do is to regroup with the bishop on f6 or directly to install the queen on f6 in order to threaten mate. Usually the bishop stays better on h6 since it doesn't allow the queen to come to f8. So king f8 or king h8 were almost compulsory moves. Knight d2. Since the white knight is the worst placed piece on b3, white decided to activate the knight, and d4 is not available yet since is attacked 3 times by the black pieces. Knight d2 looks logical. Rook c2, attacking the knight and the pawn. Black may believe that he's in charge here, but white is gaining momentum and increase the activity of his pieces with every move. Knight f3. Now 2 knight moves possibilities appear on the board: knight d4 or knight g5. Especially knight g5 looks dangerous, since the knight can be coordinated with the queen attacking f7 or h7. Rook takes a2. Now from material point of view, black has an extra pawn, since it already grabbed 2 pawns in addition with the rook that makes 7 points, while white has only knight and bishop, which sums 6 points. But after rook c1, it is obvious that the black king from a2 is out of play, and the pawn from e5 does his job, and it would be very difficult for black to organize a defense because of the e5 pawn. For the time being, only knight g5 and rook c7 are white threats, but rook c7 can be easily carry on by the black rook with rook d7. h6. Now a first weakness appeared. This chain will be vulnerable, and of course the g6 square will be weak. Unfortunately, white cannot use the vulnerability of the g6 pawn, but the main drawback of such pawn moves is that later on black won't be able to push g7, g6, since h6 will be hanging. So we are talking about a rigid pawn structure now, which means that white can already create a to-do list based on this rigid pawn structure. The black pawns will remain on this setup until the end of the game. Queen f4. White is trying to activate the queen, and it stops the advance of black pawns. If black can't advance the free queenside pawns, it means that he is not able to use his material advantage. Queen f4 plays an important role, since it threatens at some point to bring the queen on b4, and at the same time it keeps the rook a2 out of play, since rook a4 is no longer possible. King g8. Maybe black was afraid of rook c7 at some point, which stresses the vulnerability of the f7 pawn. So he played king g8 back. King h2. A nice waiting move, which releases the first rank. The white rook will be able now to penetrate in black's camp. b5. It prepares rook a4, but the rook still has to remain on the a file. Rook a4 will create some problems for white, since the queen will have to go back on g3. White used the immediate consequence and played rook c5. Always remember the consequences of your opponent's last move. The c5 square is no longer controlled, so rook c5, queen d7, queen g3, again threatening bishop h6 without waiting for rook a4. It's very frustrating for black to be the second in any action. Actually, I suppose he didn't realize what happened. King h8 and knight d4. With the help of a nice maneuver, the knight arrived on d4, the centralized square, and actually the only possibility to activate the knight. Now you see the consequences of the rushed move b6, b5. The pawns would stay better on their positions on the queen side, but it was the only way for black to create counterplay. Now white threatens to grab simply the b5 pawn, and if black pushes b5 b4, then knight c6 will follow, and the pawn from b4 will be hanging. So he played a6, rook c6. This is the key move of white's attack. Now all white's pieces are placed on ideal attacking positions. This move develops a key nice collaboration between the bishop, the knight, the rook, and eventually the queen. All you have to do when you try to coordinate pieces is to draw imaginary diagonals or lines on the board and try to see where the pieces crossroads each other. In our case, on h6, if you look deeper at the position, you'll see that the rook and the bishop are both attacking h6, and if the rook from c6 can jump on h6, then the black king from h8 will be mated. Now white threatens the pawn from a6 and created the false threat of rook d6. Actually the threat, white's threat, is much deeper, but attacking play induces mistakes. Black was used to answer to immediate threats and now didn't see this elaborated attack. I suggest you to analyze this position or positions like this over the board without chess engine's help, examining both sides' perspectives. This is a critical moment. First, focus on white's attack and the hidden connections between the pieces, between the attack elements, which are speed, number, creating a local PC superiority, pawn structures, and weak squares, how we can create a connection between these four elements. And then when you are aware of white's intentions, then switch sides and try to find defensive ideas for black. Now the only way for black to defend, or a logical way, was to play rook a3, since the rook from a2 is out of play. Rook a3 was logical, to pin the bishop from e3 along the third rank, which means that bishop takes h6 is no longer possible. But after rook d6, queen e8, for example, queen f3, white is threatening to use the overburdened position of queen e8. It threatens rook takes d8, queen takes d8, queen takes f7, king g8, queen b7, rook b8, queen e4, and white has a dangerous initiative. It threatens queen g4 followed by bishop h6. Probably black can keep the balance, but it requires defensive skills, while white can attack just seeing the connection within the between the pieces and try to coordinate his pieces in attack. Black played queen d5, trying to avoid rook d6, and the terrible blow bishop h6 followed. An amazing move. In fact, white is attacking with 4 pieces. There's a huge local PC superiority on the king's side. The point is that after black resigned here. The point is that after g takes h6, knight f5, it threatens mate, queen g7, rook g8, and rook c8. The rook will be deflected since it can't be defended. Anyway, white has a double threat. Queen takes g8 and queen g7. There's no way to defend against both threats. Only queen e5 does this, but it will be a queen sacrifice. And if after bishop h6 black plays g6, then we have this terrible complex of weak squares, and the king will be exposed on dark squares. All whites have to do is to bring the queen and to collaborate with the dark squares bishop. Queen f4 threatens queen f6, f5, bishop g5. Now we have this maneuver, bishop f6, queen h6 followed by mate on g7, queen takes d4, bishop f6, king h7, rook c7, and if the king moves, then queen h6, and if rook d7, again we have a case of overburdened piece. The rook has to defend the 7th rank and the queen at the same time, so the queen will fall after queen d4, rook c7, queen d8, and everything is clear. Try to analyze this position on your own without the chess engine's help. Try to see the hidden connections between the pieces and between the attacking elements. Till our next meeting.